I'm recording this episode in the fall of 2024. There are a lot of things going on in the world right now, and one of them is the upcoming presidential election in the United States, and that really is the context for this episode. I am not actually going to speak to anything explicitly political, so if you hear what I'm saying and you conclude, oh, this is my position or that's my position, you may be right, you may be wrong, because I'm really not intending to weave my own personal opinions. I happen to have strong opinions about this election, but I really want to focus on something which is absent from the conversation as far as I can tell, and that is what happens in a marriage when one of you is going to vote for Trump and one of you is going to vote for Kamala Harris. And you each feel extremely convicted, extremely strongly. It could be, you're both undecided and one of you is swayed this way, one of you is swayed that way. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about the marriages which are profoundly impacted because you each have really strong opinions about the election and they are the opposite, and you're interacting with people, reading news sources, and engaging on social media with people who are incredibly dismissive, disrespectful, and really think the other side is just stupid and uncaring. You can't imagine how your spouse could support a candidate who's funded in this way, who's influenced in this way, who has this personal or professional history of this sort. You can hear in what I'm saying that a really devoted person who is just thrilled that Kamala Harris is in the race could feel this way about his or her spouse. How in the heck could they support Trump? And then you share a bed with a person who is totally devoted to Trump, maybe Robert Kennedy Jr. as well. But the point is, you cannot relate to how your spouse could possibly give any attention to those idiot liberals who are woke and damaging the country. You get the idea, and that is the context. I'm not interested in focusing on the big picture positions of either party. I'm interested in focusing on what happens in your marriage when one of you is convicted in one way and the other of you is convicted in another way. And I want to just share 3 stories to open and then give some general guidelines for how you navigate this harmoniously, lovingly, and with deep respect for your marriage. So the first thing that I'll share is that growing up, when my mother married my stepfather, there was a lot of difference in political opinion. My stepfather defected from communist Romania and in many ways was a one-issue voter. He didn't really care about politics that much, but he was devoted to having a firm approach with the Soviets. So he voted for Reagan, not for his tax orientation or anything else, but because Reagan took a pretty firm line against the Soviets. My mother, actually some of my earliest baby pictures are me on my mother's shoulders. I was less than a year old, going to political rallies and advocacy experiences in the late 1960s in Greenwich Village in New York. My parents were actively protesting against Vietnam, and so the point is that my mother was highly educated liberal Democrat. And as I've already said, my stepfather, while not particularly Democrat or Republican one way or another, his vote was always going to go with the hardest line against the Soviets out of the context in which he grew up and escaped communism in Romania. So I knew as a tween and teen that whenever there was a presidential election, which was basically the only election that I really remember them voting or any of this happening, but whenever there was a presidential election, my stepfather probably wouldn't have voted because he was fundamentally apolitical, except he voted to cancel my mother's vote. Now, they did go on to get divorced, but they were married for 20 years, and this particular element is not representative of their, at the time, thriving collaborative marriage. But when it came to politics, basically my stepfather always voted to cancel my mother's vote. Okay, that's just kind of a standalone story. Now I want to talk to you about my Nana Sarah and Papa Manny. They are my maternal great-grandparents, my mother's father's parents. And while they were my great-grandparents, my mother was the first in her generation. I'm the first in my generation. And while the generations were not short, I had the immense privilege of knowing my great-grandmother for 25 years. She lived to 104, pretty sharp until the week before she passed. And so I heard so many stories from her about her really beautiful, vibrant, loving marriage. By any measure that she would have ever used, she had a very successful marriage, a happy, collaborative, joyful marriage. Of course, they had all kinds of ups and downs. That's what a long life brings, but it was a really good marriage. And my great-grandfather, Papa Manny, was a Republican, and my Nana Sarah was a Democrat. I'm Jewish, and she was an Orthodox Jew, which meant she was far more observant than Papa Manny, who was a conservative Jew. And in this day and age, these things might have spelled drama, discontent, complication, because they had such different convictions, and none of this ever got in the way of their marriage. In fact, their three children, my Uncle Dan, my Papa Bob, and my Aunt Edith, Great Aunt Edith, all three of them were unusually comfortable with people like themselves and different from themselves. My grandfather was very successful in business and well loved by employees at each level of his company. He was respectful and exemplified growing up in a home where there was an unusual level of tolerance and room for difference. And my great aunt Edith was an acclaimed Freudian psychoanalyst. And I just happened to be going through some of the papers she wrote in college recently. And it's a little bit off topic for this podcast, but she definitely, in a way that would otherwise be hard to account for, was able to hold polarizing viewpoints and be intellectually and emotionally inclusive in ways that she actually attributed to growing up at a family where there was love, connection, a very strong and beautiful family identity in which there were very big differences, as I've already outlined. And I've never heard of any of these differences causing issues in the marriage or in the family. In fact, one child walked with my great-grandmother to the Orthodox synagogue, and two children went with their father to the conservative synagogue, and none of these differences created problems. They either were neutral in impact or positive because the love, the respect, the caring created a context in which the political differences and were either irrelevant or enhanced the relationships. Now, my great-grandfather, Papa Manny, held office, local office. And so he was on the ballot as a Republican. And out of respect for his Republican candidacy, my great-grandmother did not tell people that she was voting Democrat. She didn't discuss it with anyone, which was respecting him as a Republican candidate. But there was no question that she was voting Democrat, and he knew, and it wasn't problematic. I'm guessing, I feel pretty sure that she voted for him, but otherwise she voted Democrat. And then this third story that I want to share, which is a little bit more nuanced. It's not exactly about marriage. But in 2010, my husband and I, and at the time 3 until there were 4 children, we moved to southwest liberal rural Kansas, an extremely red area of the state. And well, what I can say is that I was born in Greenwich Village. I grew up in New York and lived up and down the East Coast. I've lived in Europe. My husband and I met in medical school in New York State and then lived for our training and afterwards in Massachusetts. We were East Coast people, and at the time, the country was not so overtly divided as it currently is. And when there would be descriptions of people in the middle of the country, the ultra-conservative Christian Republicans, which now we all are familiar with these people, and perhaps you're one while you listen, but bear with me that while I was in New York and Massachusetts and Maryland, I knew plenty of Christian Republicans, but I did not know people who fit what for me just seemed like an unrealistic caricature from the New Yorker, people who had such a different point of view than I did and just readily voted for Trump the first time around. Although in 2010, Trump was not a candidate yet. And one of the ways that this really came out for me is obviously I had been in all kinds of circumstances where racism was present, but by and large, it was not overt. It was behind closed doors. It was unconscious and or invisible. And when I moved to Southwest rural Kansas, it's the first time that I lived somewhere where the racism was overt and unapologetic. The comments about Mrs. Obama's physique, just all kinds of things were just said so casually. And I wasn't surprised by anything that was said. I just was surprised at how casually and overtly those communications were made. It was like everybody was in on it and agreed and understood. And in fact, in this town where I lived, there were, population was between 25 and 30,000, and there were 6 registered Democrats. Now, when my husband and I moved there, he and I are both white. We had 3 children and then a 4th, and we're homeschooling our children. And so there were lots of people who just assumed that we were exactly the same as them, that we were homeschooling for Christian reasons because of this verse in the Bible that is interpreted that way, and that, of course, we were conservative, Republican, just evangelical Christians with a whole bunch of political points of view. So because this was new to me, I hadn't ever lived somewhere where this was the culture, I didn't recognize it right away. And in fact, I became good friends with many of the other people there, particularly other homeschooling mothers I really connected with. But it was only after I'd been there for a little while that I realized, oh, they assumed that we were just like them. We're white, we're homeschooling. Of course, we're ultra-conservative, far-right, racist Republicans. This was just presumed. If particularly the women I became friends with, if their husbands had known that actually we're Jewish, that our family votes Democrat, our parents, like that's our background, and we're highly educated and actually don't go to church and we're Jewish, we don't have all these things in common. Many husbands would never have let their wives become friends with me. But because we're white and we homeschool, and that was what they were familiar with. In fact, most of the people that I encountered had never met a Jewish person before. They just assumed we were just like them, and therefore we could become friends. But as I realized the situation, I was in a very fascinating, challenging, and for me, new experience. And I became aware that my context for connecting with people in every other time in my life before just wasn't going to work with my friends there. Many of them didn't graduate high school or did a semester of college, and I'm an MD. I have a lot of education, and that has contributed to my identity, and we didn't have that in common. We didn't have religion in common. We didn't have politics in common. We didn't have hobbies in common. We didn't have reading the Gospels in common. I mean, we didn't have the same kind of food in common, because I cared about organic food, and this was an area heavily subsidized by Monsanto, and the people had never heard that anyone would have an issue with Monsanto. To be very frank, I felt much more like I was in a foreign country than I ever had living in Switzerland and Germany, as I had done previously. But I'm very, very grateful for this experience, because once I realized, I should go on to say that these are all people who didn't teach their children evolution as homeschoolers. And my husband and I mean, he majored in neuroscience at Harvard. If you're listening, I hope it's no surprise that science is extremely important. And of course, science and evolution and the Big Bang Theory are all part of our children's homeschooling education, and none of the materials that we used to homeschool were similar to the other homeschoolers in the area and vice versa. So anyway, this led to a very reflective, introspective period in my life, because I did not want to be a hermit. I did not want to be home alone with my husband and children in all of my waking hours. While I was there, I myself was not working, just my husband. I wanted to have a social life, and yet none of the ways that I was used to connecting with people were relevant. None of my associations, the movies or books I might refer to when in conversation, they were unfamiliar to them, and vice versa. And through this experience, knowing that they were human beings and I am a human being, I realized the way to connect, the basis for being with one another in a fulfilling way, was opening my heart. It's hard for me to be more specific than that, except that I really worked with my attention. As I noticed, my attention would go to the content of conversation, or something would occur to me to share from a certain reference point, or they would share something and I wouldn't know what they were talking about. I literally put my attention on opening my heart and having human hearts be the basis of our connection, instead of all of the things that I'd previously been used to. Now I'm going to share this because I had a friend at this time who had 8 children, and the oldest, a girl, was really fed up with the evangelical, homeschooling, anti-education, insular, rural life. And so she basically was estranged from her family. And one day, this was when I'd been in Kansas for a year and a half, she called her mother and said, "Mom, I'm a secular humanist. I support LGBTQ. I believe in science and in education. I'm not a Christian." And then the very last thing, which was the biggest, was, "And I might even be a Democrat, but I want to come home. I want to see everybody." And her mother said, "Sweetheart, none of that matters, just come home." And she did come home, and they reconnected and reestablished a relationship that is respectful and really works for both of them. And what this friend of mine, this woman's mother, said to me is that if she hadn't known me, that's not how she would have answered her daughter. But through being friends with me, she appreciated that there's more to a relationship than all the same ideologies. For years, I couldn't even think about this without tearing up, because it meant that the attitude I had taken with my friends was one that this friend of mine then took with her daughter. And I share this story because if you're in a relationship where you and your spouse have different political views and things are only becoming more intense, more contentious, more fractured and like the Venn diagram showing the news and information that you're aware of and the news and information that your partner's aware of, that less and less of those two circles are overlapping. I want to talk to you in the context of these stories I've shared. The one about my stepfather countering my mother's vote, that's a throwaway, neither here nor there. But in terms of what Nana Sarah and Papa Manny created in their marriage and what I was able to experience and model for others while living in Kansas, they are both resources I want to draw on as I give now some very practical advice about how you navigate this incredibly contentious season in your own marriage. I mean, it's a super contentious season in the workplace, in the media, all over the country, all over the world, but I want to focus on the way it's contentious in your marriage. So how you navigate this is going to depend to a huge degree on the nature and quality of your connection. In your marriage, when difficult things arise, when conflicts arise, when different priorities arise, do you turn towards one another and talk it through, respectfully hearing one another's opinions, and then creatively coming to some kind of a resolution that works for both of you? If so, hang on, because I want to first talk to the people who don't do that. If you and your spouse are not skillful navigating conflict, then I highly recommend you both summarily agree to leave politics out of your home, out of your marriage, but also out of your home. Because if you have children who are listening to what one of you is saying and the other one is being quiet, that's not going to work here either. So you just, like, if your children are young enough to not be politically engaged themselves, you just summarily agree not to discuss politics until late November, knowing that one of you is going to be really happy with the outcome of the election and the other one of you is going to be very concerned and upset. And you have a contingency plan for that. Like, just agree you're not going to discuss politics at all during this time for the sake of your marriage. And you also are going to be in different locations on election day when the results are announced, so that you can each have your own experience, and it's totally fine not to share that with one another. That is one good option that you agree to, and you agree to it in the context of prioritizing your marriage. Because basically, if your marriage can't withstand all the difference of opinion, then don't bring it into your marriage. That's one way to go forward. Another way to go forward is to use this as an opportunity, not capital N, capital O, capital T, not to change one another's minds, not to convince one another of anything at all, but instead you ask questions and share how you're thinking about things with the goal of getting to know your partner more deeply. If you have total conviction one way or the other, and your partner has the opposite, the natural inclination is to want to convince them to agree with you. Don't do that. That is not going to be helpful here. What is going to be helpful, not when you're hungry or tired or otherwise pissy and resentful, but when you're peaceful, go ahead and ask, why are you choosing to vote for him? Why are you choosing to vote for her? And just ask open-ended questions, not with the goal of attack, convince, or in any way aiming to change your partner's vote, but you will get to know who they are if you listen with an open heart, almost like a research experiment where you get to explore an exotic animal and their behavior. Why is that important? Doesn't it matter to you that he XYZ? What is more important for you? What about her history of voting, this way in Congress? Is that important to you? In other words, just the way you would ask someone, let's say one of you hiked the Appalachian Trail or went on a cruise to Antarctica or volunteered in Sudan or spent a summer doing some meaningful project in Fiji or Singapore, whatever. Just the way in those kinds of situations, if you weren't there, you would ask, oh, what did you eat? And what kind of bed did you sleep in? And what did you think about when you woke up in the morning? I mean, you could ask so many questions in order to deeply understand your partner's experience. I'm suggesting that you set up times for these conversations with a clear start time and also a clear end time. You don't want this to go on forever and ever. You don't want to talk until you fight. You don't want to talk until, one of you shuts down. Start with a half an hour conversation. Start with a 10-minute conversation. And without thinking about the outcome of the election or the impact on our country, just ask questions, because there's a context, there's a reason for why your partner wants to vote the way they want to vote. And either they have information or they have some kind of a fear or an inspiration, like something is driving them. And you get to know who they are in a way that will be revealed through what they have to say, which is totally separate from trying to change their mind or thinking they're an idiot for having those convictions. So in this context, actually, I want to point you to one of my programs. I used to charge for it, but now it's available for free. And it's called The Surprising Secret to Having a Fantastic Relationship. And it is all about curiosity and how to ask questions. So if you're going to go ahead and have this kind of a conversation with your partner, I highly recommend that you listen to my audio course, The Surprising Secret to Having a Fantastic Relationship. It's about 20 minutes long, super potent, super helpful, and I'll have the link in the show notes. It's alexandrastockwell.com/secret. And that will set you up to make this a meaningful conversation. And the third thing that I want to say, after the options of just choosing not to discuss politics or really discussing your partner's political views, but less because you're discussing politics and more because you're getting to know who they are and what their priorities are and what kinds of things they've responded to without judgment, just with fascination. And then the third thing, which you can do for yourself or ideally also with your partner if he or she is in a position to participate, is talk about the foundation of your marriage. What is it that has you be together? Maybe what brought you together, but also what keeps you together. Did you come together because you feel good with one another, because you have aligned values, because you want to stay together because you're good at co-parenting, because your ways of handling finances are aligned, because of shared religion? Like, this is not an exhaustive list, but literally, why are you together? And when you've answered that question for yourself or together, then given that that's why you're together, how much influence do you want politics to have? It's like if you rank what's most important in your marriage, maybe it's good communication, supporting one another professionally, being aligned with financial goals and money management, parenting. It can be so many different things. Gratification and passion, willingness to grow and evolve. What is it that has the two of you be together? And once you're clear about that, then consider where your political views are in relationship to that. Because if there's not actually a lot keeping you together besides inertia, or because it would be financially untenable for you to split, or because you don't want to divorce because of the children, those being reasons that really are not very full of vitality, nourishment, pleasure, and connection. If that's your situation, then your differences in political views are going to have a very significant impact and remind you of how you don't like one another, that you're not with one another because you adore one another. And if your marriage is strong and robust and evolving and beautiful and connected, collaborative, well, it's okay if it's a little less connected during the election season, but don't let politics override what you have, which is so beautiful, because it doesn't have to unless you are not intentional about it. So this is a really complex subject, and it applies for all kinds of different things. I've coached couples where they had really strong convictions about whether their children should go to academically rigorous a place as possible versus a place that's warm and nurturing and oriented to the whole child. Couples who disagree on whether or not to push a child with athletics when they're gifted, but they don't really want to. And so one is like, if he doesn't want to, let it go. And the other's like, yes, but he has so much potential. Like, there are so many different contexts where disagreements are part of a marriage, and how you navigate that collaboratively or through disconnection and shutdown makes a huge difference. And so my big invitation to you, if this is a challenge that you're navigating, is that you make it right-sized. If you want to just end the relationship because you're so fed up with the difference in politics, wanting to end the relationship is not about the politics. It's because the foundational connection was not strong enough to begin with. And if you really want to continue to maintain and nourish and grow and enjoy your marriage, make the political stuff right-sized. And that probably is a lot smaller than it's been, because our country's going to continue. Your concerns are valid. And in your marriage, what matters is the quality of your connection. Connection over content. Don't let the political content override the quality of your connection. So I've shared actually a lot of personal stories. I've never done a podcast episode on this topic. And if this is relevant and speaks to you, please reach out and let me know. I'm on social media. You can send me a message, or you can go to the contact page on my website, alexandrastockwell.com/contact, and let me know, did this resonate? Does it serve? Do you have other ideas? Is there some other advice you have for how to navigate this? This is a big issue at this time, and if you have something that works and I haven't addressed it, or I have, but you have a different flavor, let me know. I'd love to share it, because every one of you listening gets to use this time to improve and deepen your relationship, whether you're aligned or misaligned when it comes to politics. And as I complete this episode, I want to urge all of you to listen to The Surprising Secret to Having a Fantastic Relationship, because even if politics isn't an issue in your marriage, conflicts arise, and this 20-minute audio is magnificent for inspiring you to navigate them well.